So, Geoffrey, welcome to the morning edition.
Good morning.
Let's start with the basics. What is genocide and what is not genocide?
Genocide, very briefly, is the intention of killing or dismembering someone because of their race or their religion. Things they cannot help. But, although they can help with their religion perhaps, but things which do not set them aside from any provocation or criminality, but just kill them like, of course, the Jewish.
And so what is not genocide? Because I think there's many misconceptions, right, that people
There
have.
certainly is. If there's a lot of killing, a lot of deaths, people say, oh, it's genocide. And it's not. I mean, they say the British Parliament the other year decided that the Chinese were guilty of genocide because of their mistreatment of the Uyghurs. They weren't. It was actually an offence, the way they're herding people into re-education camps in that part of China, but it wasn't genocide. Similarly, a lot of people were arrested after the fall of Cambodia. If you remember, Cambodia had people were actually wiped out. Over 1 million people were killed, but they were killed pursuant to a Khmer Rouge ideology. They were not killed because of the race or the religion of the victims. So it's got to be race or religion. That's wrong in my view, because I don't see why Operation Condor, which was Pinochet's killing of left-wingers throughout South America, should be exempt. If you kill Marxists because they're Marxists and for no other reason, that seems to me as serious as killing Anglicans or killing black people. But it's not genocide. Genocide is narrowly defined in this sense as killing people because of their race or their religion, not because of their politics. If you kill people because of their politics, as Israel claims it's killing Hamas, that we could call politicide, but not genocide. Genocide is a particularly hideous crime and has particular consequences, requiring other signatories to the Genocide Convention to come in and stop it. That's why genocide is particularly important because America has signed up to it, which it doesn't to other international laws, and particularly important historically because it was the first way out of this world without law, without international criminal law. And genocide was the first, and it is particularly important because of Australia's part in it, which you might ask me about.
I definitely want to know about that. And perhaps you can wind that into, I guess, how the crime of genocide actually came about. Because people always, of course, refer to the Holocaust as being a crime of genocide. But, of course, that crime didn't actually exist when the Holocaust took place.
At Nuremberg, it wasn't charged.
No, it was mentioned as to describe the crimes as I understand it, but it wasn't actually the charge.
It didn't become a crime until 1948 and the Genocide Convention.
So take us through this
and
how
you've got to understand, once upon a time, there was no such thing as international criminal law. And once upon a time, governments could get away with doing anything to their own people because they couldn't be prosecuted for killing large swathes of their own people, which some governments did. And the first government to do that in spades was the Ottoman Empire, basically Turkey, enlarged Turkey. And they killed 1 million of Armenians who were within their borders. And in 1950, it was an alliance between Germany and Turkey, known as the Ottoman Empire, in those days. And in 1915, after the beginning of the First World War, there was a conference, and they discussed the way in which the Turks had mass murdered the Armenians, and Britain, France, and Russia issued an edict saying this will be punished. This is a crime against humanity. This was the first time a crime against humanity had been mentioned. And it was because of the attempted annihilation of the Armenians, who were treated rather as the Jews were later treated by the Germans. And the Germans, of course, were there watching and actually quite horrified at what was happening to the Armenians. But it was Turkey, it was a Polish Jewish law professor who started to take note and to write about the need for international law, because the British took 60 or 70 of the Turkish mass murderers off to Malta, planning to put them on trial for mass murder of Armenians. And suddenly some British lawyers for the government said, you can't prosecute them. Why? Because they were obeying the law of their own country. There was no international law.
And, of course, the crime of genocide, though, didn't actually come into being, I think, until 1948.
That's right.
So I guess maybe just walk us through briefly how it eventually became a crime.
It became the obsession of this Polish law professor called Raphael Lemkin. And he became obsessed. He wrote books and lobbied all at the post-war conferences about genocide. Mm-hmm. He defined genocide.
Because he coined the term, right?
He coined it. It's killing and race. It's a race killing in a sense. And he argued for an international law to override local law. And he was such a nuisance. He ended up in the custody of the Canadians, the Canadian embassy, at the time when the Versailles Convention was being... Sorry, cut that. At the time when the post-war, post-Nuremberg discussions were taking place. And the Canadian ambassador couldn't stand him and said, let's get rid of him. Let's palm him off on the Australians. Dr. Evatt, he was as mad as he is.
Australian Foreign Secretary at the time.
It so happened Doc Evatt was the Australian Foreign Minister and had played an enormous part in the post-war order at San Francisco in 1945 and had become, by popular acclaim, the third president of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So what the Canadians didn't realize was that Lemkin and Evatt got on like a house on fire, and Evatt was a total recruit to Lemkin's idea. And it was Evatt who ensured that the Genocide Convention came for decision in front of the General Assembly on the 9th of December 1948. And the next day, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So even before the Universal Declaration, which Eleanor Roosevelt presented to Dr. Evatt, saying it would be the Magna Carta for mankind, we had the Genocide Convention thanks to Dr. Evatt. Without Evatt, we would not have, certainly not at that period, a law against genocide. The next great moment for genocide was the signing up of the United States, because the United States historically doesn't do international affairs, doesn't align with international conventions, and the US did not take on board the Genocide Convention. until many years later, during the Reagan presidency, Ronald Reagan went off to Germany and visited Bitburg Cemetery. Now, Bitburg Cemetery is where a number of SS leaders were buried. And there was an enormous fuss in America stoked by one Michael Moore. Do you remember Michael Moore?
Of course. You say this is his most successful protest in your book, I believe.
His most successful protest was to fly to Bitburg at the time Reagan was visiting and hold up placards saying SS graves here, beware. And there was a great fuss in America. The Jewish lobby was outraged, and to placate them, the idea came up, and the Reagan presidency adopted it, of ratifying the Convention Against Genocide. So it was a very important event that America, as well as most other countries, were signed up to a convention that required them to intervene if genocide was being committed. And that, of course, was the case 10 years later in Rwanda. And we had the most shameful debate in the Security Council, where New Zealand and Czechoslovakia, who were members, said we've got to intervene to stop the genocide, which was obviously genocide in Rwanda. And the British said, but we'll be bound to put boots on the ground if we do. And the Americans, too, started to weasel out, to pretend that it wasn't genocide. It was the breakdown of a peace agreement. It was black-on-black violence and so forth. So that was disgraceful. But they weaseled their way out of their obligations under the Geneva Convention, for which they were subsequently apologetic. Bill Clinton visited Rwanda, apologized but kept his plane engines running while he made this apology from the steps of the plane. So the Genocide Convention really, I think, showed its possibilities and its power, and also the desire of the big nations to avoid the consequences of a rule against genocide. Now, we have had a number of charges of genocide leveled in the African wars. We have had a number of charges brought home to the generals who ordered the extinction of 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. So genocide is certainly alive in the world, but it's difficult to prosecute.
Well, we're going to get into that in just a moment, but if you could maybe contextualize, I guess, for listeners, just how rare it is, because if I'm right about this, and I think I've read this in your book, I think has there only been maybe 3 genocides that have been successfully prosecuted in international court. Is that right?
Srebrenica is the most important because we have a number of generals who are in prison for life. General Mladic, who kept hidden for 17 years, was finally dragged off, and several other generals have been convicted for genocide for that particular event, which involved the killing of 8,000 by Bosnian Serb troops who were blessed by the priests of the Orthodox Serbian Church, and then went on a killing spree, and 8,000 men and boys were liquidated. And so that certainly has been a genocide that all the courts have accepted.
But is it fair to say that it's rare to have a conviction for genocide?
Well, that's because it's rare to be prosecuted. The case of Cambodia, everyone was geared up to prosecute, and when someone pointed out that they weren't killed because of their race or their religion, so that had to be retracted. And because you've got to prove a specific intention, this is what is at stake, if you like, in the the International Court of Justice case that's been brought by South Africa against Israel. Question Israel says, and Israel only defends itself when it's got a good chance of winning. So this is it's not game over simply because the ICJ has said that it's arguable, it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide. Plausible is a word that, as far as lawyers are concerned, indicates it may go either way. And so what the International Court of Justice is doing, and it's taking them a year to look at the evidence and decide whether they can infer that Israel's intention was to kill the Palestinians because they were Palestinians, rather than because they were tools of Hamas.
Well, take us through this, because my understanding is to prove genocidal intent or to charge someone with genocide, you have to prove that genocidal intent was the sole intent in what motivated your actions. So it can't be that you perhaps partly intended to wipe out a group based on its racial or ethnic belonging, and that partly it was, self-defense, and partly it was, perhaps, protecting your country's national security. It has to be the sole intention. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's one view. It's not mine, because I think it's crazy, because people have 2-3 intentions in killing. It's quite possible for Israelis to kill because they hate Palestinians. It's also quite possible for them to think that they are destroying Hamas, which is a political organization, or they may have no view. But it's possible to have a number of intentions. So I would prefer to, if I were a judge, which I've been, of this particular question of interpreting the Genocide Convention, I would say that it has to be the dominant intention. Okay. But there are other views. Some would say if it's one intention among a number, you can still be guilty of genocide. So that's a matter that the ICJ will no doubt pass upon.
And so how is genocidal intent actually proven?
Well, often by speeches, by public speeches. Several of my members of my chambers were on the South African team that presented the case to the International Court of Justice, and they rather wisely began their submissions with statements from Israeli leaders, which were obviously dripping with genocidal intention, calling Palestinians animals. They were all guilty. And as far as collective responsibility was concerned, this was the basis of a number of Israeli politicians, including the president, who then ticked off the Australian government, I think, with ultimate hypocrisy. But that was the basis for launching the South African case, the genocidal intent shown by politicians from their public speeches. Of course, there are other private speeches, private minutes of meetings and so forth are very important. It was, as Robert Jackson, who was the prosecutor at Nuremberg, said, well, it was the Teutonic habit of writing everything down that enabled the prosecution at Nuremberg to show that the Nazis were malign in their private meetings and had planned the destruction of the Jewish people. There was a long line of memoranda. So that can also be important. And of course, you can infer an intention from what is done.
So can you give me an example of that? Yeah.
Well, look, there are 62,000 deaths, mainly of young people and women in Gaza. There were, in the Blitz, only 60,000 killed. I mean, this is more than Dresden, more than the Blitz, more than died in these other devastating bombings and so forth. That you could infer from that, and the South Africans are inviting the court to infer that this is the intent behind it must be to kill Palestinians rather than only officers of Hamas.
And why is it so crucial, if it is, to determine whether a genocide has actually taken place? And what are the real-world consequences after a genocide has been declared?
Well, the question is, what should be the real-world consequences? Because the declaration of genocide is a green light for all decent countries to get together and to stop it. This is what should have happened in the 3 months in which in Rwanda, the Hutus were butchering with knives and with the Tutsi minority. So that should have been the subject of an intervention by the United Nations. It wasn't.
So what happened? The killing just kept going?
Factor emerged. America was not keen to put more lives, its own people, at risk. There was no intervention, and the killing continued until about 800,000 were dead. So the Genocide Convention was meant to have plugged in then. It didn't, and that is something that we have to consider, that while the Genocide Convention should require the United Nations to intervene, the United Nations at the moment is permanently polarized, because the idea in 1945 was that the Security Council would run the General Assembly as a kind of talking shop. The Security Council is where the power lies. But as time went by, the Security Council became polaxed between Russia and China on one hand, and America is unsafe at the moment because it's generally dictated to by Israel. It's not a body that is reliable in terms of keeping the peace.
And what you're referring to there is the fact that Russia and China and America, they've all got veto power, essentially,
of course,
right? So that's what you're saying. They're just going to,
It's the destruction of the world order is really the Security Council veto powers, where Russia will veto any resolution for peace in Ukraine, just as America will veto any resolution for peace in Gaza, because it's the... and it is really, it sums up the impotence of the Security Council by saying that if Russia were to drop a nuclear bomb on Kiev tomorrow, Russia could not be expelled from the United Nations because it requires a resolution from the Security Council, which Russia would veto. So the Security Council is worthless when it comes to great power. In a sense, the powers of 1945, which were assumed to guarantee the peace, are now the warmongers of 2025.
Okay, now I'm hoping you can walk us through in really sort of easy to understand steps, perhaps. What is the case for the argument that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza? Like, if you were Israel's, lawyer, what would you be arguing?
You'd be arguing, and Israel does have a very good lawyer, and you can tell whether Israel has a case or not from the fact that they actually send lawyers to argue it. Very often they don't.
Right.
They're all They simply stood aloof. They had no case, so they didn't have anyone arguing it. But they have a top British academic putting their case that this is an attack on Hamas, that Hamas provoked them with the obscene action on October the 7th. So this is all within their right to self-defense. And so they particularly avoid the genocide label because they're not collectively punishing. They would argue, Palestinians, they are only punishing Hamas, and anyone else who gets in the way is what is called collateral damage. That would be their argument. That is their argument. We wait to see their final submissions and their evidence to support it.
And so let's take the opposite side of the coin. What is the case that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza? What would you be arguing?
Well, they've committed, 62,000, more than the deaths from the Blitz during the war, which is the archetypal terrorizing of a population by bombing. That the intention can be inferred to be that of killing Palestinians because they're Palestinians, not because they're members of Hamas, that the particular actions, the bombings, the use of drones on residential areas, burying large swathes of the population under rubble and having them retrieved dead, is indicative of a determination to collectively punish the Palestinians for being Palestinian. And there have been statements that will be used, are being used by Israeli leaders, more or less saying all Palestinians are complicit in the Hamas attack. So that will be the argument for South Africa, and how it will play out will depend on evidence, and the evidence is still coming in. It will not close until January, and then I think South Africa will probably be entitled to put its own evidence in. So we may not get a decision.
For how long?
For another year.
Another year, okay. And I wanted to ask you about one particular, type of action that Israel has used in Gaza, which of course is the cutting off of fuel and food, medicine and water supplies. So, because people use that on both sides to argue for and against the case that genocide is happening. So how would you use that for the case of genocide, that is an example that this is genocide?
Yeah, well, it is clearly one of the actions that is non-specific to Hamas. It isn't only Hamas fighters who are hungry. In fact, there's some evidence to show that they are, in fact, the best fed, that starvation is particularly of babies, children who are not capable at their age of forming a political intention. So that would be used. But starvation is of itself a war crime. It is one of those crimes that is specified by Article 8 of the Treaty of Rome, which is a 1998 convention setting up the International Criminal Court. So starvation can be prosecuted and is, in fact, being prosecuted against Netanyahu and his defense minister by the ICC, the International Criminal Court.
But tell us what Israel would say in their own defense, because I believe their line is, they say, well, no, this is, we want to stop this aid from getting to Hamas. This is,
they've got a whole list of defenses that they've run publicly. But how it all shakes down will not be known until next year.
And so from a legal standpoint, do you have an opinion as to whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza?
No, of course not, because the court has to decide a number of issues. Firstly, about the definition of genocide, whether they're going to say it has to be one intention or whether there can be multiple intention, or whether, as I think, it should be dominant intention. So that's one question that the court will have to resolve. And there are other legal issues as well that it will have to decide, because while there have been quite a few genocide cases over the years decided by lesser courts, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is the world court, and this will be the definitive decision on genocide.
I really wanted to ask you, and this is a hypothetical, should the ICJ actually rule that Israel has violated the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, who would or could be actually charged with that crime, which we were discussing before we started recording? That would only happen if the International Criminal Court, which is a separate court to the International Court of Justice, because I'm just going to let listeners know what I only learned from reading parts of your very big book, which is that the International Court of Justice only resolves disputes between states, but the International Criminal Court actually prosecutes crimes such as genocide. So I guess, would it be Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Would it be others? Who would it actually be?
Well, as we know from various local proceedings in relation to rape and so forth, that criminal courts must deliver verdicts on evidence that decides beyond reasonable doubt of guilt. Civil courts, on the other hand, apply the test of more likely than not. So the ICJ ruling on Israel being genocidal is not, that can have consequences in civil law. It can require Israel to repay a lot of the damage, or pay for some of the damage it's done.
Yes.
But it cannot have direct criminal consequences. It's the ICC that can bring a charge of genocide against Israeli leaders. And no doubt, with the evidence from the ICJ collected as part of it, can produce that evidence for a prosecution. Whether it will succeed in the heavier burden of proof is another matter.
And do you have any opinion as to who would be more likely than not to be charged with genocide by the ICC?
Well, obviously Netanyahu would be the prime, and a number of his cabinet ministers. I don't know what the evidence is
but could it be
to them, but if it emerges that a majority of the cabinet or certain members of the cabinet have insisted upon the kind of total annihilation of residential areas in Gaza, well, that may well be the case that they'll be prosecuted. However, of course, the ICC does not do trials in absentia, so they will have to be arrested, and America, without doubt, will act so as to prevent that. So this is where
politics
the
intervenes.
Ideal of law comes up against the brick wall of political favoritism and the fact that America will protect Israel from any consequences.
So what you're saying is that, and this is obviously quite a hypothetical because we're nowhere near this point, but if the International Criminal Court actually did charge the Israeli Prime Minister and his ministers and whoever else of genocide, they could just refuse to go to The Hague because the ICC does not, as you say, hold trials in absentia. So they could just refuse to go, and therefore they could not be held to justice. Is that right?
That's so, unless the ICC, as I've recommended and others, change and allows trials in absentia, because that is a way, at least, of getting a record getting a historical record. And this, we've got to remember, is the great thing that the trial at Nuremberg did.
Yes.
The trial at Nuremberg produced an imperishable record that has confounded Holocaust deniers ever since. And I think that to get such a record of what actually was behind the mass killings that I think have shocked the conscience of the world, 62,000, mainly women and children, is something that increasingly has seen, sadly, it's increased anti-Semitism around the world, illogically. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that is the world over the years to come will want an answer for. And if Israel is seen to be ducking it, if Netanyahu and his more right-wing cabinet ministers are indicted and then fail to surrender to a court which itself is the result of the world's concern about the Holocaust, it will be live on their conscience.
Right, okay. Well, thank you so much, Geoffrey, for your time.
Good to meet you.